The Wentworth Mansion's drawing room was a reflection of its owner. Chaotic, intriguing, and utterly inappropriate for a formal meeting. Books were stacked in improbable corners, as if they were barricades against any attempt at civility. Lady Katherine Wentworth, the shrew who made lords stammer and ladies swoon, was strategically positioned in front of the fireplace, an ironic smile playing on her lips. "So you came here in person, Your Grace?" Katherine tilted her head, her disheveled brown hair falling over her shoulder. "Is this an honor or a threat?" Nathaniel Gray, the Duke of Westcott, remained unfazed. His impeccable coat stood in stark contrast to the nearly bohemian surroundings, and his expression was unreadable. "I believe it to be an opportunity, Lady Katherine. But that depends on your perspective." Katherine narrowed her eyes, clearly assessing the man before her. Nathaniel was a mystery to her, not because he was hard to decipher, but because he seemed flawless. A duke with an impeccable reputation, a gentleman who didn't tolerate frivolities. The sort of man she despised. "Opportunity," she repeated, as if the word tasted bitter. "My dear Duke, I suppose you have something more specific in mind. Please get to the point, as I have more important things to do, like figuring out how to avoid this sort of conversation in the future." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. "Marriage." Katherine blinked, once, twice. Then she threw her head back and laughed, a clear, melodic sound that was strangely menacing. "Ah, I see. You've come to propose marriage. Well, allow me the courtesy of informing you that this sort of proposal from any man has been declined so many times I've lost count. But coming from you—" "Hear me out before you judge," Nathaniel interrupted, his voice firm. "This is not an ordinary marriage I'm proposing." That caught her attention. Katherine crossed her arms, leaning forward slightly. "I'm listening." "I offer freedom," he said, his words as precise as blades. "You will be my wife in name only. No interference in your personal life, no control over your choices. In return, you will help me silence certain rumors that tarnish my name. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement." Katherine frowned, though the corners of her lips twitched, threatening a cynical smile. "And why, exactly, do you believe I would agree to something so ridiculous?" "Because, Lady Katherine," he replied, stepping closer so only she could hear. "It would give you a weapon against everyone who ever dared to underestimate you. Imagine what an untamable duchess could do in London." The air seemed heavier as Katherine deliberated. She knew Nathaniel was playing on her pride, and annoyingly, it was working. The chance to prove her superiority to society was tempting, but agreeing to any kind of marital alliance? That felt like a betrayal of her very essence. "So, let me get this straight," she said, her tone deliberately provocative. "You need me to salvage your reputation, and in return, I get the freedom to continue being a nuisance to everyone around me?" Nathaniel smiled for the first time that evening. "Precisely." She began pacing the room, her fingers idly grazing the stacked books. "Tell me, Your Grace, what's the real reason behind this proposal? I don't believe it's just about your reputation." "You're right," he admitted, which surprised her. "My younger sister is about to make her debut, and I need to protect her name. A scandal involving an unmarried duke wouldn't help." Katherine stopped, spinning on her heels. "Ah, so this isn't about me, it's about your family. How predictable." He shrugged. "And what's wrong with protecting those I love? Something tells me you'd do anything for your family too, even if they don't deserve it." The blow hit its mark. Katherine's expression hardened, though not before Nathaniel caught a flicker of vulnerability. Yes, he had studied the untamable shrew before making his move, and knew exactly where to strike. "Let's say I accept," she said, trying to sound indifferent. "How long would this charade last?" "Long enough for us both to get what we want. After that, you'll be free of me, in name and in practice." Katherine moved closer to the fireplace, staring into the flames as she weighed her options. Accepting meant committing to something she had always despised. Refusing meant staying exactly where she was, trapped in a life without real purpose, but with her pride intact. "If I accept," she began, turning back to him, "there will be terms, and I guarantee you won't find them agreeable." Nathaniel tilted his head in a gesture of respect. "Name them, and we'll see." "First," she began, raising a finger, "you will never, under any circumstances, interfere in my activities, appropriate or not." "Agreed." "Second, I will not be obligated to attend events I find dull." "Agreed." "And third," she gave him a dangerous smile, "if you ever try to control me, I guarantee your reputation will be the last thing you'll need to worry about." Nathaniel smiled, a cold, challenging smile. "Then we have a deal, Lady Katherine." The handshake that sealed their pact felt more like a duel than the beginning of a partnership. Katherine couldn't decide what was more irritating: the fact that she had agreed to the plan of a duke she barely knew, or Nathaniel's triumphant expression when the deal was struck. Sitting in the tea room of her stepmother's house, she stirred her spoon with such force it seemed she was trying to destroy the bottom of the teacup. "A marriage," she muttered to herself, her tone dripping with disdain. "Me, bound by a contract." Across the table, her younger sister, Eloise, watched her with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "So, you're really getting married?" Katherine scoffed. "Not a marriage, Eloise. An arrangement." "And what's the difference?" the younger girl asked, nibbling on a biscuit. "The difference, my dear sister," Katherine replied, pointing the spoon like a sword, "is that he will have absolutely no control over me. It's merely a game to deceive society." "But he's a duke," Eloise exclaimed, as if that solved everything. "And they say he's incredibly handsome." "Handsome?" Katherine laughed, though her cheeks flushed as she recalled Nathaniel's piercing gray eyes. "Darling, beauty is just a distraction for weak minds." Eloise tilted her head, thoughtful. "Maybe, but distractions are sometimes necessary." Meanwhile, at Westcott Manor, Nathaniel sat in his study, discussing the details of the plan with his confidant and butler, the ever-practical Mr. Kavanaugh. "With all due respect, Your Grace," said Kavanaugh as he placed a tea tray on the desk, "I cannot help but think this strategy may be, how shall I put it? Rather risky." Nathaniel sipped his tea, his eyes scanning the papers on his desk as if they held some hidden answer. "I know, Kavanaugh, but Katherine is the only person who can make this work. She has the strength and audacity required." "Or perhaps just the stubbornness," Kavanaugh countered with a faint smile. "Both," Nathaniel admitted, running a hand through his hair. "And that's exactly what I need." 2 days later, Katherine found herself standing before Nathaniel again, this time in the garden of his estate. He was waiting, impeccably dressed, while she arrived deliberately late, her hair tousled by the wind and a mischievous smile playing on her lips. "Lady Katherine," he greeted, inclining his head. "It seems the concept of punctuality is foreign to you." "Punctuality is overrated," she replied with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Now, let's get to the point. What exactly do you want from me, beyond pretending to be your wife?" Nathaniel took a deep breath. "You'll need to play the part of a perfect duchess. Appearances at social events, exemplary behavior." "Oh, that will be a challenge," she interrupted, laughing. He ignored the sarcasm. "And most importantly, convincing society that we are a happy couple." "Happy?" Katherine placed her hands on her hips, her tone dripping with mockery. "Oh, Duke, no one will believe that." Nathaniel crossed his arms, his patience clearly being tested. "You're a talented actress, Lady Katherine. Use it to your advantage." "It's not just talent," she said, leaning toward him. "It's an art, and I happen to be exceptional at it." For a brief moment, his eyes flickered with something she couldn't quite place. Admiration, perhaps. But it was quickly replaced by his usual neutral expression. By the end of the meeting, Katherine had agreed to attend a formal dinner the following evening, where they would be introduced as an engaged couple for the first time. As she walked back to her carriage, something stirred inside her. It wasn't fear or anxiety, but a curiosity that irritated her deeply. Nathaniel Gray was unlike any other man she had met. He didn't try to control her with sweet words or veiled threats. On the contrary, he seemed to genuinely respect her intelligence and her ability to make decisions. And somehow, that was more dangerous than anything else. That evening, Eloise burst into Katherine's room carrying a pile of dresses. "You need something perfect for tomorrow." "I don't need to impress him," Katherine replied, flipping through a book without glancing at her sister. "It's not about him," Eloise countered, an astute smile on her face. "It's about everyone else. You want people to see you as a duchess, don't you? Then dress like one." After much resistance and a fair amount of eye-rolling, Katherine allowed Eloise to choose a navy silk gown, simple yet elegant. "If I'm going to fall, I'll do it in style," Katherine muttered, staring at herself in the mirror. The dinner at Westcott Manor began predictably formal. Lords and ladies exchanged polite comments as Katherine and Nathaniel made their entrance side by side. The gazes of those present were like arrows aimed at her, analyzing her every move, every smile. Katherine, however, was unfazed. In fact, she seemed to revel in the attention. "You're surprisingly good at this," Nathaniel murmured to her as they took their seats at the table. "I told you," she replied, smiling at him with feigned sweetness. Everything was going smoothly until Lady Standish, one of society's most influential matrons, leaned toward Katherine and asked, "So, my dear, how did you win the Duke's heart?" Katherine felt every eye in the room turn toward her. Nathaniel waited, curious to see how she would respond. With a charming smile, she said, "Oh, my lady, it was very simple." He realized no one else could tolerate his temperament. The entire table erupted into laughter, but Nathaniel looked at her with something that seemed like a mix of irritation and respect. The dinner had been a success, or at least that's what Katherine thought as she leaned back against the seat of the carriage on her way home. She was exhausted, but pleased with herself. Lady Standish hadn't known what hit her, and Nathaniel, well, he seemed torn between wanting to strangle her and admitting she was brilliant. "A promising start," she murmured, more to herself than to Eloise, who was accompanying her. "Promising?" Her sister looked at her incredulously. "You insulted a duke in public. Are you trying to cause a scandal before you're even married?" "I didn't insult him," Katherine corrected, her tone dripping with irony. "It was just a little provocation. And honestly, if he can't handle that, he's dealing with the wrong woman." The next morning, Nathaniel sat in his study, reviewing the correspondence already arriving about the previous night's dinner. Reports of laughter and remarks about the charming irreverence of his future wife were everywhere. "Lady Katherine has a unique talent for making an impression," remarked Mr. Kavanaugh as he set a cup of coffee before the Duke. "Talent or trouble," Nathaniel muttered, though a glimmer of humor danced in his eyes. "She turns even criticism into admiration. It's unsettling." Kavanaugh offered a subtle smile. "Perhaps it's exactly what your grace needs." Nathaniel didn't reply. He knew Katherine was a force to be reckoned with, but he was also beginning to realize her presence affected him more than it should. Katherine, on the other hand, seemed unbothered as she strolled through the garden of her family's estate that afternoon. Her father, Viscount Wentworth, had a remarkable talent for avoiding difficult conversations, a talent Katherine secretly admired. "So, my dear," he began cautiously, "this arrangement with the Duke of Westcott, are you sure about it?" She paused to study a blooming flower, the wind tousling her brown hair. "Sure? But has that ever stopped anyone before?" "I just want you to be happy, Katherine," he said softly. She smiled, though there was a trace of melancholy in her eyes. "Happiness is an overrated idea, Father. I'm looking for something more useful." That evening, Nathaniel sent a message to Katherine requesting her presence at his estate to discuss the upcoming social events. For a change, she arrived on time and was greeted by the butler. "His Grace is waiting for you in the library," Kavanaugh said with a faint smile that Katherine interpreted as a mix of sympathy and amusement. When Katherine entered the library, Nathaniel stood by the lit fireplace, his posture as commanding as ever. "Lady Katherine," he began without preamble, "we need to discuss your tendency to improvise." "Improvise?" Katherine crossed her arms and raised an eyebrow. "I'd call it natural talent." Nathaniel ignored the jab. "The goal here is to convince society that this is a solid, harmonious marriage. We don't need more attention than necessary." "Oh, so you want me to be boring?" she retorted with a grin. "Sorry to disappoint, but that's not in my repertoire." He sighed, rubbing his temple as if dealing with a stubborn child. "I'm only asking that you keep the scandals to a minimum." "No promises," she said with an exaggerated blink. Despite the tensions, the two continued planning the upcoming social events. Their forced proximity began to reveal subtle facets of their personalities. Katherine noticed that Nathaniel, despite his rigid demeanor, had a dry, unexpected sense of humor. "You know no one believes we're happy, right?" she commented casually as they reviewed the guest list for an upcoming ball. "Happiness isn't what we're selling," he replied without looking up from the paper. "We're selling stability." "Oh, how romantic." He finally looked at her, and something in his gaze sent a chill down her spine. "Romance was never part of the contract, Lady Katherine. But perhaps you'll find stability has its charm." The next day, they attended an informal event at the Royal Park, a gathering for London's elite. Katherine, dressed in a green gown that made her eyes stand out, walked beside Nathaniel, attracting stares and whispers wherever they went. "They're studying us like ravens circling a carcass," she murmured to him, her smile remaining perfectly in place. "Then give them something to look at," he replied, extending his arm for her to take. Katherine hesitated briefly, then placed her hand on his arm, her movements poised and deliberate. The gesture was simple, yet it carried a weight neither of them could fully dismiss. As they strolled together, appearing every bit the composed couple society expected, Katherine couldn't shake the feeling that the line between performance and reality was beginning to blur. Katherine hesitated for a moment before accepting. The warmth of his touch surprised her, but she maintained an air of composed detachment. As they walked, a group of ladies approached, led by Lady Standish. "Your Grace, Lady Katherine," said the matron with a probing smile. "What a lovely couple you make." Katherine tilted her head, feigning modesty. "Ah, Lady Standish, the credit is entirely His Grace's. He has divine patience, considering my eccentricities." Nathaniel rolled his eyes discreetly, but responded with a polite smile. "Katherine is a free spirit, but that's precisely what makes her so fascinating." The night was cold, and Westcott Manor, glowing with candlelight, felt like a haven against the chill wind blowing outside. Katherine sat in the main hall, a glass of wine in her hand, stealing occasional glances at Nathaniel. He was engrossed in a stack of papers, likely some tedious documents regarding his estates. "You work too much," she remarked, her voice breaking the silence. Nathaniel looked up, his brows raised. "I prefer to keep my mind occupied." "Ah, I see. Thinking too much can be dangerous," she replied, a faint smile curling her lips. "You speak as if from experience," he said, his deep voice laced with curiosity. Katherine hesitated. It wasn't her nature to open up, but something in Nathaniel's expression disarmed her. Thinking too much leads to questions, and questions lead to answers that perhaps we'd rather avoid. The ladies sighed wistfully, and Katherine barely managed to suppress a laugh. Back in the carriage, Katherine finally let out the laughter she had been holding in. Free spirit? Fascinating? That was hilarious. Nathaniel, seated across from her, smiled faintly. "I merely spoke the truth." She stopped laughing, startled by the sincerity in his tone. For a moment, the carriage was silent. the only sound coming from the wheels rolling over the cobblestones. "You're a mystery, Nathaniel Gray," she said at last. "And you," he replied, "are the exact opposite, and yet equally intriguing." "And what answers do you prefer to avoid, Lady Catherine?" She laughed, but there was a hint of vulnerability in her tone. "Ah, Your Grace, that's something even my family wouldn't dare to ask." Nathaniel studied her for a moment before leaning forward slightly. "Perhaps it's because your family is afraid of hearing the answer." Her eyes met his, and for the first time, Katherine felt that Nathaniel was not just the calculating man he appeared to be. There was something deeper, something she didn't yet understand. The next morning, both their routines were interrupted by an unexpected letter delivered by a messenger. Nathaniel opened it cautiously, his eyes narrowing as he read. "Katherine," he called, his voice firm. She entered the study, finding him with a concerned expression. "What is it? Some lord offended by my behavior?" "Not this time," he replied, handing her the letter. "It seems someone is spreading rumors about us." Katherine read it quickly, her blood boiling with each line. "They really think they can threaten us with this? The audacity." "It's not just about us," he said gravely. "My sister is involved now. We need to find out who's behind this." The pair decided to attend a ball that evening to investigate the source of the rumors. Katherine, in a daring red gown that contrasted beautifully with her brown hair, looked every bit the Duchess, though one no one would dare underestimate. "You look ready to cause a scandal just by existing," Nathaniel murmured as they entered the ballroom. "That's the goal, isn't it?" she replied, her eyes scanning the crowd. As they mingled with the guests, Katherine noticed furtive glances and hushed whispers following them. They were being watched, no doubt about it. At one point, Katherine encountered Lady Standish, who seemed particularly interested in the latest gossip. "My dear Lady Catherine," the matron said with a sly smile, "I hear your engagement to the Duke has been interesting." "Interesting is the right word," Katherine replied smoothly, without missing a beat. "You know, it's hard keeping up with a man like him, always so reserved, so mysterious." Lady Standish's eyes sparkled with curiosity, clearly fishing for more. Katherine, however, offered nothing but an enigmatic smile, leaving the older woman to draw her own conclusions. Lady Standish leaned in slightly. "Ah, mysteries. They're so dangerous, don't you think?" Katherine merely smiled, but something in Lady Standish's eyes set her on edge. She knew more than she let on. Meanwhile, Nathaniel found himself in a tense conversation with an old rival, Lord Harrington. "You really think you can fool everyone with this farce of a marriage?" Harrington mocked, holding a glass of wine. "I have no interest in convincing you or anyone else," Nathaniel replied, his voice controlled but dangerous. "But if you know anything that might help clarify these rumors, it would be wise to share." "Perhaps," Harrington said with an unpleasant smile. "Or perhaps I'd rather enjoy watching you drown in your own game." After the ball, Katherine and Nathaniel gathered in his study to discuss their findings. "Lady Standish knows something," Katherine began, settling into an armchair. "But she won't give it up easily. Women like her prefer to manipulate rather than expose." "And Harrington?" she asked, glancing at Nathaniel. "He's clearly involved, but he's careful. We have no solid proof." Katherine sighed, running her hands through her hair. "So we're surrounded by smiling enemies. Delightful." Nathaniel observed her for a moment, a nearly imperceptible smile tugging at his lips. "You really are unpredictable, Katherine." That night, alone in her room, Katherine let her thoughts wander. The past she had worked so hard to bury felt closer than ever. Her childhood, shaped by impossible expectations and quiet rejections, had forged her aversion to commitment. She thought of her mother, a rigid and calculating woman who had always insisted that love was a weakness. Katherine had grown determined never to depend on anyone. not even a duke. But Nathaniel was different. He didn't demand submission or change. On the contrary, he seemed to challenge her to be even more herself. While Katherine grappled with her own demons, Nathaniel sat in his room, staring at the engagement ring meant to symbolize their pact. He had never imagined that a fake marriage would make him start questioning his own solitude. Katherine intrigued him. Her courage, her audacity, even her insolence, all of it seemed to chip away at the facade he had carefully constructed over the years. They were both playing a dangerous game, not just against society, but against their own hearts. The morning was shrouded in mist as Nathaniel mounted his horse, determined to clear his thoughts before the day began. Long rides were his usual remedy for a restless mind, but today, no amount of wind against his face seemed to dispel the turmoil Katherine had stirred within him. She doesn't do anything the way she's supposed to, he muttered to himself, guiding his horse through the fields of his estate. And yet, there's something about her that completely disarms me. He knew that getting emotionally involved was the last thing he should allow, but the more he tried to keep his distance, the more he found himself drawn to the audacity and the vulnerability Katherine concealed so well. Katherine, meanwhile, was lost in her own thoughts as she roamed the Westcott Manor library. Books had always been her refuge, but today, even the most intriguing pages couldn't distract her. "What is he hiding?" she murmured, snapping a book shut. Nathaniel was a mystery she couldn't yet unravel. He was controlling, reserved, but there were moments, rare, yet unmistakable, when he seemed human. She shook her head. "I'm overthinking again. This never ends well." That afternoon, a forced meeting brought them together once more. Lady Standish had organized an exclusive tea, and Katherine knew she had to attend, not just to maintain appearances, but to uncover more about the rumors swirling around them. As they walked to the carriage together, Katherine glanced at Nathaniel with a teasing smile. "Tell me, Your Grace, do you always have as much fun at these events as you appear to?" He didn't answer immediately, but the corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "I'd say my enjoyment is directly proportional to the amount of trouble you cause." "Ah, then today will be unforgettable," she replied, giving him a playful wink. At the tea, Katherine quickly noticed that the atmosphere was more tense than usual. Lady Standish seemed especially attentive to every word and gesture, as though waiting for a misstep. Katherine, however, didn't falter. With a radiant smile and sharply polished responses, she navigated the conversation masterfully. Nathaniel, watching her from a distance, couldn't help but admire the way she handled the situation. Katherine wasn't just surviving in that hostile environment. She was thriving. "She's a spectacle in her own right," he murmured quietly to Kavanaugh, who stood by his side. "Indeed, sir," the butler replied with a restrained smile. "And perhaps that's why everyone is so captivated by her." When the event finally ended, Nathaniel escorted Katherine back to the carriage. The silence between them was comfortable, yet charged with unspoken thoughts. "You were remarkable today," he said, breaking the silence. "Oh, don't exaggerate," she replied, though her tone lacked its usual irony. "I was just playing the game." "No, Katherine," he insisted, meeting her gaze directly. "You did more than that. You command the game." She averted her eyes, startled by the sincerity in his voice. It was rare to hear Nathaniel speak without a trace of calculated reserve, and it disarmed her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Later that night, as Katherine walked through the halls of Westcott Manor, she heard voices coming from Nathaniel's study. The door was slightly ajar, and she hesitated before stepping closer. "I can't let this happen again." Nathaniel's voice sounded tense. "But sir," Kavanaugh replied, "the past cannot be erased. All we can do is ensure it doesn't destroy the present." Katherine frowned. What was he hiding? And why did he seem so tormented? The next morning, Katherine confronted Nathaniel as he worked through papers in the library. "What are you hiding?" she asked bluntly. He looked up, clearly taken aback by her directness. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play coy," she said, stepping closer. "I heard you and Kavanaugh last night. Something from your past is haunting you, and I think it's time you told me the truth." Nathaniel's expression darkened, his guard snapping back into place. "Eavesdropping, Lady Catherine. That's beneath even you." "Perhaps," she shot back, unflinching, "but I have a stake in this charade, and if your secrets threaten everything we've built, I have a right to know." For a long moment, they stared at each other, the tension between them thick enough to cut. Finally, Nathaniel sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Fine," he said, his voice low. "But be careful what you wish for, Catherine. Some truths are better left buried." "Ah, yes, you do," Catherine insisted, crossing her arms. "I heard you last night. Something is going on, and if we're going to continue with this arrangement, I need to know what it is." Nathaniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's from my past, Catherine. Something I'd rather keep buried." "But the dead don't stay buried for long, Nathaniel," she said softly, stepping closer. "I know that better than anyone." He finally relented, sinking heavily into a chair. "Years ago, before I took on the dukedom, I made a choice that cost my family dearly. A woman, someone I thought I loved, used me to advance her own position. By the time I realized, it was too late. My family bore the consequences, and I swore I'd never let it happen again." Catherine felt a pang of sympathy, but there was something else too. "And that's why you chose me, isn't it? Because I'm the opposite of that. I don't want anything from you beyond what we agreed on." Nathaniel met her gaze, his expression somber. "Yes, but ironically, that makes you the greatest risk of all." His words left her momentarily speechless. Nathaniel Gray, the seemingly unshakable man, was admitting that she unnerved him. "Well," she finally said, trying to lighten the mood, "it's good to know I can still cause a decent amount of confusion." He chuckled softly, a rare but genuine sound. "You are a walking storm, Catherine, but for some reason I can't help but want to see what comes next." She smiled, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "Then you'd better brace yourself, Duke, because I have no idea what comes next either." The sky was overcast that morning, mirroring the heavy tension hanging over Westcott Manor. Nathaniel had just received an anonymous letter, the crumpled paper still in his hand as he paced the library. "The threat is clear," Kavanaugh said, watching him with concern. "If this spreads, not only will your reputation be at risk, but Lady Catherine's as well." Nathaniel scowled. "They know exactly where to strike. Catherine is the key to making this entire charade work. If she's discredited..." He didn't finish the sentence. The thought of Catherine being targeted by malicious rumors unsettled him more than he cared to admit. She smiled. "Not of what matters." That evening, the two headed to a ball, knowing Lord Harrington would be in attendance. Catherine was stunning in a black gown with gold accents, every movement of hers drawing eyes. She knew she would need to use every weapon at her disposal to extract information from Harrington. "Remember," Nathaniel said as she prepared to approach him, "he's dangerous." "And I'm more," Catherine replied with a confident smile. Nathaniel watched her as she made her way toward Harrington, feeling a tightness in his chest he couldn't quite explain. Catherine began the conversation with her usual mix of charm and wit. Harrington, predictably, couldn't resist. "You certainly have courage, Lady Catherine," he said, a sly smile on his face. "Facing society head-on, even with so many rumors swirling." "Oh, Lord Harrington," she replied, her voice sweet but sharp. "Society always talks. It's up to us to decide whether to listen." As they conversed, she carefully prodded him, attempting to make him slip and reveal something. At last, a misstep. "Perhaps I know more about those rumors than you'd imagine," he said, his arrogance on full display. Catherine kept her composure, but inside she felt victory within reach. "Do you now? Then why don't you enlighten me, Lord Harrington? I've always appreciated a good story." He laughed, but before he could respond, Nathaniel appeared at her side, his commanding presence silencing Harrington. "Looks like the fun's over," Harrington said with a forced smile before walking away. Katherine turned to Nathaniel, her eyes blazing. "I was about to get something." "And I wouldn't risk you for it," he replied, his voice low but resolute. Back in the carriage, the silence between them was heavy. Finally, Katherine broke it. "You need to trust me, Nathaniel. I know what I'm doing." "And I know what's at stake," he replied, his eyes locked on hers. "I can't lose you, Katherine. Not like this." Her words caught him off guard, but she didn't retreat. Instead, she leaned in slightly, her voice soft. "Then perhaps it's time you realize I'm not as easy to lose as you think." The rain poured torrentially that morning, as if the sky knew of the impending confrontation. Katherine stood in the hall of Westcott Manor, her fingers drumming against the banister as she waited for Nathaniel. He had convened a meeting with key allies, but this time, Katherine was determined to act on her own. "You're planning something," Eloise said, watching her sister with a suspicious look. "I always am," Katherine replied, fastening her coat. "But this time, it's bigger. If Harrington thinks he can toy with my name and Nathaniel's, he'll learn what it means to cross a Wentworth." Eloise sighed, knowing she couldn't stop her. Meanwhile, Nathaniel was in the study, discussing strategies with Kavanaugh and other trusted allies. The anonymous letter and Harrington's behavior were clear signs of a larger plot. "He wants to destroy my reputation," Nathaniel said, his eyes dark. "But Katherine, she's at the center of this. If he succeeds in discrediting her, there'll be no way to protect anyone." "Then we must protect her first," Kavanaugh said calmly. Nathaniel nodded, but his heart was uneasy. Katherine was a force of nature, impossible to control, and that worried him as much as it captivated him. While Nathaniel worked on his plans, Katherine was already taking action. Using information gathered during the ball, she had tracked down one of Harrington's associates, a man of dubious reputation who seemed to know more than he let on. Dressed discreetly and accompanied by Eloise, Katherine met the man in a dimly lit tavern. "Lady Katherine?" he said, surprised to see her. "This is highly inappropriate." "I live to be inappropriate," she replied, taking a seat across from him. "Now, tell me what you know about Harrington's plans, or I'll make sure your life becomes far more difficult." The man hesitated, but Katherine's intensity disarmed him. "Harrington has compromising correspondence about the Duke's past," he finally said. "Letters that could be used against him, and against you." "And where are these letters?" "He keeps them on his estate in a safe in his study," the man answered, clearly nervous. "But Lady Katherine, going there would be suicide." She smiled, rising to her feet. "Then it's a good thing I'm a natural survivor." Back at Westcott Manor, Nathaniel realized Katherine was nowhere to be found. Her absence sent his stomach into knots. Something was wrong. "Kavanaugh," he called, his voice urgent. "Find Katherine now." Kavanaugh hesitated before replying. "She left early, sir, with Miss Eloise." Nathaniel felt a wave of frustration and fear. He knew Katherine was impulsive, but this was beyond reckless. "I'm going after her," he said, grabbing his coat. Meanwhile, Katherine was preparing to break into Harrington's estate. She and Eloise had infiltrated the grounds with the help of a rented carriage, and now Katherine was at the study window, carefully trying to open it without making noise. "Are you sure about this?" Eloise whispered, clearly terrified. "Absolutely," Katherine replied with a mischievous smile. Once inside, Katherine began searching for the safe the informant had described. She found it hidden behind a painting, but before she could open it, footsteps echoed down the hallway. The door burst open, revealing Harrington in all his arrogant glory. "Lady Katherine," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "What an unpleasant surprise." "I could say the same, Lord Harrington," Katherine replied, lifting her chin. I was just admiring your art collection, though I must say, your taste leaves much to be desired." He laughed coldly. "You have courage, I'll give you that, but it won't be enough to save you now." Before Harrington could make a move, the door opened again, and Nathaniel stormed in like a thunderclap. "Harrington," Nathaniel said, his voice firm and icy, "I suggest you think very carefully about your next move, because if you so much as touch Katherine, there won't be a place in this world where you'll be safe." Harrington hesitated, clearly stunned by the Duke's presence. "You truly came to save her? How admirable. But that doesn't change the fact that both of you are in a compromising position." "And you," Katherine interrupted, gesturing toward the safe, "are in an even worse position considering what you're hiding in there." With Nathaniel's help, Katherine opened the safe and uncovered the compromising letters. She held them up with a victorious smile. "It seems the game is over, Lord Harrington." Back in the safety of Westcott Manor, Katherine and Nathaniel finally had a moment of peace. "You're impossible," he said, looking at her with a mixture of irritation and admiration. "But you're also brilliant." "And you," she replied, her tone softening, "are stubborn, but surprisingly loyal." For a moment, the silence between them was filled only with the sound of the rain outside. Then Nathaniel stepped forward, moving closer to Katherine. "I can't lose you," he said, his voice low but intense. She smiled, touching his face. "And you never will." When their lips met, it was as if all the tension that had built up between them finally gave way, leaving only the beginning of something true. Epilogue. The start of something true. The Westcott Manor ballroom was illuminated by hundreds of candles, their light reflecting off the mirrors and polished floors. The gentle music of a quartet filled the air, blending with the hum of conversation among the guests. Katherine, now officially the Duchess of Westcott, moved through the room with the grace of someone completely at ease in her role. "You look more comfortable than I expected," Nathaniel said, approaching her with a subtle smile. "You forget, Your Grace," she replied, with a playful wink. "I'm an exceptional actress." "Ah, but now you're not acting," he countered, his voice soft. "You're living." The wedding ceremony had been a quiet yet profound event. To everyone's surprise, and especially to Katherine's, Nathaniel had insisted on an intimate moment, far from society's prying eyes. "Why a simple wedding?" she had asked him. Nathaniel had taken her hand and replied, "Because this is about us, not them. And I don't need the world's approval to know what we have is real." Katherine had been left speechless, a rare occurrence for her. Now, as they stood side by side in the grand ballroom, their gazes met, and the world around them seemed to fade. "To new beginnings," Nathaniel said, raising his glass. "To a life worth living," Katherine replied, her voice filled with warmth. And as the music swelled and the night continued, they both knew this was not the end of their story, but the true beginning of something extraordinary. "Because this is the one thing in our lives that shouldn't be a spectacle," he had replied, his eyes fixed on hers. The memory of that moment brought an unexpected warmth to Katherine's chest as she now watched the guests. Lady Standish, as always, wasted no time approaching her for conversation. "My dear Duchess," she said, a sly smile on her lips, "who would have thought you'd finally surrender to marriage?" "Oh, Lady Standish," Katherine replied, her tone deliberately light. "Marriage is not a surrender, it's a battle, and I plan to win it every single day." Nathaniel, listening nearby, couldn't suppress a laugh. "And I can assure you, she is destined for success," he added, leaning slightly toward Lady Standish, who was visibly at a loss for words. However, society had already shifted its opinion of Katherine. The exposure of Harrington and the revelation of his compromising letters had not only strengthened Nathaniel's position, but also Katherine's. "You turned your greatest critic into your strongest advocate," Eloise commented as she helped Katherine adjust a brooch. "Oh, dear sister," Katherine replied. "Sometimes the best way to win is to leave them with no other choice." After the festivities, Nathaniel and Katherine found themselves alone in the moonlit garden. He watched her silently, admiring how at ease she seemed, even in a luxurious gown, with a tiara glinting in the light. "You know," he began, his voice soft, "I never imagined it would end like this." "This?" she asked, tilting her head with a curious smile. "You and me," he replied, stepping closer. "A partnership that started as a farce and became everything I didn't know I needed." Katherine smiled, but there was a gentleness in her expression. "To think I once believed I'd never let myself be tied to anyone." "Tied?" Nathaniel repeated, feigning offense. "I prefer to think you simply decided we're better together." She laughed, a clear, joyful sound that echoed through the garden. "Oh, Your Grace, how modest you are." He laughed as well, pulling her closer. "Perhaps, but I know when something is right, and you, Katherine Gray, are the greatest right of my life." As they danced under the moonlight with no music but the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, Katherine realized her life had changed in ways she never could have imagined. Nathaniel was not just her husband. He was her equal, someone who challenged and accepted her in equal measure. And for the first time, she felt she could be entirely herself, without fear of judgment or rejection. Nathaniel, in turn, found that Katherine had brought something missing from his life. Chaos, yes, but also passion, laughter, and a sense of freedom he hadn't known he longed for. Together, they were stronger, more complete. "So," Katherine said, breaking the silence as she stepped back slightly. "What will our next battle be, Duke?" He smiled, pulling her back into his arms. "Whatever it is, Katherine, we'll face it together." The night ended with the two of them side by side, gazing at the stars and making plans for a future that, while uncertain, was brimming with possibilities. And so, the indomitable shrew and the reserved Duke found not just each other, but also the certainty that, together, they could weather any storm. If you loved following the whirlwind romance between Lady Katherine and Duke Nathaniel, you can't miss The Duke and Cinderella, a lady without a name and a secret that could destroy everything. In this new story, an even more intriguing mystery arises when a lonely Duke encounters an enigmatic young woman, hiding a secret that could shake all of society. Will their love be enough to face the challenges and uncover the truth? Discover how pride, courage, and the desire to belong can change lives and hearts. If you enjoy lighthearted and fun love stories, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more romances like this one. Today, we learned that love is a blend of trust, respect, and the courage to face life's storms together. Just as Lady Katherine and Nathaniel discovered, the greatest challenges can transform into the most beautiful connections. Now, I want to hear from you. Comment the phrase, "Secrets change everything," if you enjoyed the video. And in the first pinned comment, I've shared links to some amazing Regency-era books I've read and recommend. Check them out.